Emmons County, North Dakota, April 1897. The wind of the northern plains had no argument with the land. It simply scoured it clean. It was a wind that had traveled 1,000 miles without seeing a tree, and it treated the new plank cabin of Wilhelm Radenz as a temporary inconvenience. But Radenz was not fighting the wind. He was planting. With a length of twine stretched between pegs and a hand-forged dibble, the German-Russian immigrant moved with a slow, rhythmic precision that baffled his neighbors. He wasn't plowing a field or digging a well. He was planting trees, tiny Ponderosa pine saplings, no thicker than his thumb, in 3 perfectly straight, gently curving rows around the north, northwest, and west sides of his unfinished 18 by 24-foot home. Harmon Wickersham, the Emmons County land assessor, reined in his horse, his ledger book tucked securely in his saddlebag. He watched for a long moment, a frown deepening the lines around his eyes. He was a man who understood acreage, property lines, and the brutal calculus of homesteading. He did not understand this. "Radenz!" he called out, his voice sharp against the wind. "What in God's name is this foolishness?" Wilhelm straightened his back, wiping a bead of sweat from his brow with the back of a calloused hand, though the air was cold. He looked at the neat rows of fragile saplings, then back at the assessor. "It is a fence," Wilhelm said, his accent thick and guttural. Silas Croft, a neighbor whose own claim bordered Radenz's to the east, rode up alongside Wickersham. He let out a short, barking laugh. "A fence? A fence of sticks? The deer will walk through it and the wind will ignore it. By winter, you'll have nothing but 200 frozen twigs. The man is mad." The sentiment rippled through the small community of sodbusters and homesteaders. They were practical people, their lives dictated by the harsh realities of sun, soil, and storm. They built with thick sod or heavy planks. They dug deep and hunkered down. This planting of delicate trees, this slow, almost ceremonial activity, felt like a profound waste of time and energy. It was Radenz's folly, a joke told over weak coffee in drafty cabins. It was the act of a man who simply did not understand the prairie. What did this German-Russian from the Black Sea steppes, this quiet shelter belt planter, understand about the physics of prairie wind that the seasoned, suffering homesteaders of North Dakota had missed? His neighbors saw foolishness. He saw a shield that would take 8 years to grow. If you've ever felt a bitter wind, find the one tiny gap in your winter coat, or heard the windows rattle in a storm and wondered how much fuel you had left, then stay with us. The story of Wilhelm Radenz isn't just about a strange-looking homestead. It's about a forgotten form of genius. I promise you will learn the simple, powerful science of how a living wall can defeat a polar vortex. And if you believe that quiet knowledge sometimes speaks louder than loud opinions, consider subscribing to our channel for more stories of forgotten ingenuity. Let us know in the comments, what's the cleverest low-tech solution you've ever seen for a big problem? Wilhelm Radenz was not a carpenter, though he could build a sturdy wall. He was not a farmer in the American sense, though he knew the soil. He was a Krimdeutscher, a German-Russian whose ancestors had been invited by Catherine the Great to tame the vast treeless steppes of the northern Black Sea coast, a land not unlike the one he now called home. He was a man whose trade was passed down through generations, a trade that did not exist on the American frontier. He was a planter of shelter belts. His hands, which now patted the dark North Dakota soil around the tender roots of a Ponderosa pine, had spent a lifetime working with the tools of a different reality. He knew the heft of a planting spade, the precise moisture content of soil needed for a sapling to take root, the geometry of wind, and the patient language of trees. His father and grandfather had not managed fields of wheat. They had managed the great, miles-long belts of pine and poplar that protected those fields. vast green walls planted by imperial decree to shield the Russian breadbasket from the desiccating winds sweeping off the Asian interior. He had come to America with his wife Annalise and their two small children, Matthias and Clara, seeking land and freedom. They found both, but they also found a cold of an intensity that even the Crimean steppe had rarely offered. Their first winter, spent in a hastily constructed soddy burrowed into a low rise, was a lesson in pure misery. It was a cold that broke things. Wilhelm had borrowed a neighbor's heavy iron plowshare to break ground for the spring, and on the first draw through the frozen earth, the coulter had cracked with a sound like a rifle shot. The metal itself had surrendered. Annalise had returned from a visit to the circuit pastor, her face pale. The pastor's baptismal register, a book of births and deaths that chronicled the entire community, had been left overnight in the unheated church. When he opened it for the first service, the ink in the bottle on his lectern was a solid block of black ice, and the ink already on the page, recording the birth of a neighbor's child, had frozen and flaked away, leaving nothing but a ghost of a name. The most chilling moment for Wilhelm came on a particularly brutal morning. He reached for his thick wool cap, which he had left hanging on a wooden peg in their main room, the warmest part of the soddy. As his fingers closed around it, the frozen wool fibers gave way with a faint, dry crackle. A fissure ran across the crown as if it were made of brittle pottery. It was not just cold. It was a force of physics that changed the very nature of matter. That winter, as he fed cord after cord of precious cottonwood into their small stove, only to feel the cold seep back in moments after the flames died down, he knew that a thicker wall was not the answer. The enemy was not the temperature. The enemy was the wind. The failure of conventional frontier building in the face of a North Dakota winter was not a failure of material, but a failure of imagination. Homesteaders built thick walls of sod or plank, chinked the gaps with mud, grass, or newspaper, and banked the foundations with earth. They fought a defensive war against the cold, and they were losing. The problem wasn't the R value of their walls. The problem was the relentless, kinetic force of the wind. The science is called forced convection. In still air, a layer of relatively warmer air, a boundary layer, clings to the outside of a cabin wall, slowing the rate of heat loss. But on the open prairie, a 40-mile-per-hour north wind is a physical abrasive. It is a river of frigid air that actively strips that boundary layer away, moment by moment, maximizing the temperature difference across the wall and sucking heat, measured in British thermal units, or BTUs, out of the structure at an astonishing rate. A cabin that might be comfortable on a calm day at 10 below zero became an icebox on a windy day at the same temperature. Wilhelm's neighbors understood the effect, if not the name. Silas Croft, a capable man with a strong back, had cut what he thought was a generous 10 cords of wood. By late January, the pile was gone. He was reduced to burning twisted slough grass and dried cakes of manure, which filled his small cabin with an acrid smoke and provided a sulking, inadequate heat. His wife and 3 children spent their days huddled around the stove, wrapped in every blanket they owned. Jedediah Mills, another neighbor, had a newer plank cabin, well-built and tight. He had spent weeks stuffing every conceivable crack with a mixture of lard and shredded newspaper. Still, the wind found its way in. It didn't need a large gap. The sheer pressure differential it created across the building was enough to force cold air through the tiniest imperfections in the wood itself. Frost grew an inch thick on the heads of the nails inside his walls, miniature columns of ice conducting the exterior cold directly into his living space. The constant shrieking howl of the wind was more than a sound. It was an oppressive physical presence, a tireless engine of cold that never, ever stopped. The settlers burned wood not just to create heat, but to fight the speed at which the wind stole it. It was a battle of attrition they could never win. The following spring, Wilhelm Radenz began his work. But he did not start with his cabin. He started with his fence. With Annalise helping him hold the twine taut, he laid out the blueprint not of a building, but of a microclimate. He marked the ground for 3 concentric curving rows of trees, wrapping around the future site of his home like a protective arm, facing the teeth of the prevailing winter winds from the north and west. The geometry was precise, born of centuries of observation on another continent. The saplings within each row were planted 8 feet apart. The rows themselves were spaced 10 feet from one another. The innermost row stood exactly 12 feet from where the wall of his cabin would be. He dug 200 holes, each one a promise. He carried buckets of water from his well, giving each fragile sapling a drink, before tamping the soil firmly around its base. Only when the last of the 200 Ponderosa pines was in the ground did he begin digging the foundation for the house itself. To his neighbors, this was backward and bizarre. You built your shelter first, then you worried about aesthetics. But to Wilhelm, the trees were the shelter. The wooden house was just the room inside. By midsummer, as Wilhelm was raising the plank walls of his 18 by 24-foot home, Harmon Wickersham returned. The land assessor was not a malicious man, but he was a man of rules and regulations, and what he saw set his teeth on edge. He dismounted, his official ledger under his arm, his expression grim. "Radenz," he began, foregoing any pleasantry. "I have been to the land office in Bismarck. I have been reviewing the statutes." He tapped a finger on his ledger. "The Timber Culture Act of 1873. It allows a homesteader to claim an additional 160 acres if they plant 10 acres of it with trees." Wilhelm nodded, hammering a nail into a floor joist. "I have heard of this law." "Indeed," Wickersham pressed on, his voice rising with bureaucratic indignation. 10 acres. That's 435,600 square feet. What you have here," he swept a hand toward the fledgling pines, "is maybe 1 acre of planting at best, and you've planted it directly around your dwelling, inside your primary homestead grant, not on a separate claim. You're not filing a tree claim, but you're planting just enough to make a mess of the paperwork. To any federal inspector, this looks like a failed, confused attempt to game the system. I have to note it in my assessment, Radenz. I have to write down that the claimant has established an anomalous and non-compliant timber planting. It could jeopardize your final patent on this land." The threat was clear and serious. A bad report from the county assessor could mean the loss of everything. Silas Croft, who had been watching from his own property line, walked over. "It's a waste of good water is what it is," Silas said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice. "And a fire hazard. Come a dry August, this whole place will go up like a torch." Another homesteader, hauling lumber in a wagon, stopped. "And what good are they in winter? They'll be nothing but sticks in the snow, collecting drifts right up against your walls. You'll have to shovel your way out till May." "It's the damnedest, most foolish thing I've ever seen." Wilhelm Radenz laid down his hammer. He looked at Wickersham's concerned, angry face. He looked at the mocking eyes of his neighbors. He turned and looked at his 200 saplings, their green needles shimmering in the Dakota sun. He would not, could not, explain the physics of fluid dynamics to them. He turned back to the assessor and spoke with a quiet finality that allowed no argument. "It is not for timber, Mr. Wickersham," he said. "It is for the wind." Then he picked up his hammer and returned to his work, leaving the men standing in a cloud of confused silence. The sound of his hammer blows was the only reply. The genius of Wilhelm Radenz's design was not in what it stopped, but in what it did. It was a living machine for manipulating the physics of the air itself. To understand it, one must first understand the prairie wind, not as a weather condition, but as a massive moving fluid with immense kinetic energy. A 40-mile-per-hour wind isn't just windy, it's a relentless river of atmosphere pressing against everything in its path. Building a solid wall against it is like trying to dam a flood with a single plank. The force will find a way over, around, or through. Wilhelm's shelter belt was not a solid wall. Its genius lay in its carefully engineered porosity. When the 40-mile-per-hour wind hit the first, outermost row of Ponderosa pines, it wasn't blocked, it was disrupted. The flow was forced through the gaps between the trees, breaking the solid front of air into smaller, turbulent eddies. This turbulence consumed energy, slowing the wind down. The trunks and needles created drag, literally robbing the wind of its momentum. Having been slowed and broken by the first row, the wind then encountered the second, staggered row. The process repeated, but this time it was acting on air that was already less organized and moving slower. More energy was dissipated. Finally, it hit the third row, which scrubbed most of the remaining force from the lowest levels of the airflow. The most critical effect, however, happened above the trees. Unable to push directly through the dense three-row barrier, the main body of the wind was deflected upwards, lifting it off the ground. This created a vast zone of relatively still air on the leeward side of the belt, a wind shadow. The science of shelter belts, perfected on the Russian steppe, had shown that a properly designed windbreak creates a significant zone of calm that extends downwind for a distance of at least 10 times the height of the trees. The saplings Wilhelm planted in 1897 would take 8 years to reach a mature height of 30 feet. By the winter of 1905, his shelter belt would be casting a wind shadow nearly 300 feet long. His cabin, nestled only 12 feet behind the innermost row, sat deep within the calmest part of this invisible harbor. The implications for his family's survival were staggering, and they could be measured in numbers. Outside the shelter belt, the air temperature might be a lethal 38 degrees F. A 40-mile-per-hour wind combined with that temperature produces a wind chill factor of 52 degrees F. This isn't a subjective feeling, it's a measure of the rate of heat loss from any warm object, be it human skin or a cabin wall. But inside the wind shadow, where the wind speed at the cabin's surface was reduced to perhaps 10 miles per hour or less, the effective wind chill plummeted. The same 38-degree chaff air now felt like 22 degrees. This dramatic change in the exterior environment transformed the thermodynamics of the house. A typical, unprotected plank wall in a 40 mph wind might hemorrhage heat at a rate of 42,000 BTUs per hour. But by calming the air around the exact same wall, Wilhelm's shelter belt slashed that heat loss to just 22,000 BTUs per hour. He hadn't added a single inch of insulation to his walls. Instead, he had fundamentally altered the physics of the environment in which his walls existed. The result was revolutionary. His small wood stove, which would have fought a losing battle in a conventional cabin, could now easily maintain a comfortable 68 degree temperature inside, and it did so while burning less than half the firewood his neighbors required. He wasn't just building a home, he was terraforming his own small piece of the prairie. For 8 years, the pines grew. The mockery faded into a kind of grudging acceptance of Radenz's eccentricity. His folly became a landmark. Then came the winter of 1905. It arrived not as a storm, but as a siege. A vast mass of polar air descended from the Arctic, parking itself over the northern plains. For 13 consecutive nights, the temperature plunged to a sustained 38 degrees. And with it came the wind, a relentless 40-mile-per-hour gale from the north that stripped the insulating blanket of snow from the open prairie, leaving the black earth exposed and frozen to the consistency of iron. Kerosene flames in lamps burned with a strange, blue tinge, a sign of the intensely cold, dense air. For Wilhelm's neighbors, it was a catastrophe. The brutal physics of forced convection became their daily reality. At Silas Croft's homestead, the woodpile he had thought enormous was dwindling with terrifying speed. His family lived in a single room, the windows sealed with ice, the children coughing in the cold, smoky air. The wind was a physical beast, shaking the cabin on its foundations, its howl a constant, unnerving scream that frayed the nerves and chilled the soul. At Jedediah Mill's place, the fight was already lost. His family huddled together for warmth, their breath fogging in the air of their own home. Every nailhead in the walls was a point of brilliant white frost, a tiny, efficient conductor pulling the life out of the room. A pot of water, left on the stovetop only a few feet from the firebox, had frozen solid before the coals from the last fire had even cooled to gray ash. The cold was winning, but at the Radenz homestead, a different reality prevailed. The first thing a visitor would have noticed was the sound, or rather, the profound lack of it. Outside the triple ring of 30-foot pines, the northern gale shrieked with undiminished fury, a sound like tearing canvas that filled the sky. But inside the shelter belt, that apocalyptic roar was muted to a distant high-altitude hiss. The air in the yard around the cabin was almost still. Inside the 18 by 24-foot house, there was an impossible peace. The wind did not rattle the windows or shake the walls. Wilhelm's son, Matthias, now a teenager, sat at the table reading a book. His daughter, Clara, helped her mother, Annalise, with her mending, her fingers nimble and warm. The cabin was held at a steady, comfortable temperature. The ultimate proof of this defiant warmth sat on a simple wooden shelf in the parlor. It was a large stoneware crock filled with dough for kraut runzas, a savory meat and cabbage-filled pastry traditional among the Black Sea Germans. Annalise was preparing them for the upcoming Fasching celebration, the carnival before Lent. In any other cabin in Emmons County, that crock of dough would have been a frozen, lifeless lump. But here, in the quiet warmth of Wilhelm's cabin, the yeast was still alive. The dough was still gently rising, warm and active, a small, edible miracle of life defying the frozen world outside. Normalcy was the ultimate luxury, and here it was simply a fact. Harmon Wickersham was on the tax circuit, a grim tour of duty in the heart of the polar outbreak. His job was to assess winter damages for the county, documenting the brutal toll the cold was taking on livestock and property. It was a journey through a landscape of failure. He saw cattle frozen standing in the fields, their bodies like statues of ice. He saw the cracked foundations of barns and the desperate, smoke-stained walls of cabins fighting a battle they could not win. The journey itself was an ordeal. The wind, a physical enemy that sought to strip the heat from his body. The steel runners of his sled groaning in protest on the iron-hard ground. As he neared the Radenz claim, the sound of the wind was a deafening roar. He was hunched deep in his furs, his face a mask of ice. Then it happened. With a sharp crack that echoed like a gunshot in the frigid air, the front right runner of his sled snapped clean through. The brittle, supercooled steel had surrendered to the cold and the rough ground. He was stranded a mile from the nearest neighbor in the full murderous force of a 40-mile-per-hour wind at nearly 40 below. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through his layers of wool and fur. He had to find shelter immediately. The only structure in sight was Radenz's cabin, sitting oddly serene inside its dark green ring of trees. Cursing his luck, Wickersham abandoned the broken sled and began to stumble toward the pines, leaning into a wind that felt like a solid wall. He fought his way to the first row of trees, pushing through the stiff, fragrant branches. The force of the wind lessened, just slightly. He was gasping for breath, his lungs burning. He plunged through the second row. The wind dropped again, noticeably this time. He was no longer fighting with every step. Finally, he stumbled past the third row of pines and into the 12-foot clearing between the trees and the cabin wall, and the world stopped. The apocalyptic, soul-stealing roar of the wind vanished. It was simply gone. The air, which moments before had been a physical assault trying to tear the flesh from his bones, was now profoundly, shockingly still. It was deeply cold, yes, but it was a quiet, passive cold, not an active, violent one. The silence was more stunning than the noise had been. He leaned his back heavily against the rough bark of a Ponderosa, his chest heaving. He could hear the high-pitched shriek of the gale passing harmlessly overhead, 30 feet above him. He pulled off a thick mitten, his fingers clumsy with cold. He held his bare hand up. He could feel the deep, penetrating cold of the still air around him. Then he slowly angled his hand past the edge of the shelter belt's protection, exposing it to the open prairie. The effect was instantaneous and violent. The wind bit and tore at his skin, a sensation of such savage cold it felt like a burn. He snatched his hand back into the sanctuary of the calm air as if he had touched a hot stove. The cabin door opened. Wilhelm Radenz stood there, silhouetted by the warm light from within. He wore no heavy coat, just a simple wool shirt. He showed no surprise, no triumph. "Are you all right, Mr. Wickersham?" he asked, his voice calm. Wickersham was speechless. He stared at the quiet, sturdy cabin, then at the wall of pine that stood between it and the howling chaos, then back at the man who had built it. The memory of his own words from 8 years prior, foolishness, madness, offense of sticks, burned in his mind. "Radenz," he stammered, his voice hoarse. He looked at the trees, then back at Wilhelm. "My God, I thought you were building a fence." He struggled for the right words, his mind trying to process the impossible sensory evidence. "You haven't just built a house. You've broken the wind." Wilhelm invited him inside. The warmth of the cabin hit Wickersham not as a gentle comfort, but as a physical blow. He stumbled in, peeling off his frozen outer layers. He saw the scene of impossible domestic peace, the children reading, the woman sewing, and on the shelf, the crock of rising dough. In that moment, the land assessor from Bismarck understood everything. He wasn't just standing in a warm room. He was standing inside an idea. Harmon Wickersham did not just file a corrected report. He became a missionary. He had witnessed a miracle of physics, and he felt a duty to spread the gospel. He rode back to Bismarck, not to file a routine assessment, but to tell a story. He wrote a long, detailed letter to the editor of Der North Dakota Herald, the German-language newspaper that served the immigrant communities of the plains. He described his own skepticism, the community's mockery, and the brutal reality of the polar outbreak. Then, with the zeal of a convert, he described the cracked sled runner, the terrifying exposure to the wind, and the shocking, profound silence he found inside Wilhelm Radenz's wall of trees. He explained the result in the practical terms his readers would understand: a warm home, safe children, and a fraction of the firewood. The newspaper, whose readership was composed of people who understood the tyranny of a steppe climate, printed the story in its March 1898 edition. Crucially, they also printed a copy of a simple, hand-drawn diagram Wilhelm had given to Wickersham. It showed the 3 rows, the 8-foot spacing between trees, the 12-foot gap to the house, and the crucial orientation against the north and west winds. The idea, now codified and published, spread like wildfire through the German-Russian community. These were people who recognized the wisdom of their homeland translated to their new one. That spring and summer, A quiet revolution in architecture took place across the Dakota Prairie. By the autumn of 1898, 9 other Black Sea German farmsteads in Emmons and neighboring Logan County had planted their own 3-row shelter belts. They were no longer called Radenz's Folly. They were called Schutzpflanzungen, protection plantings. Decades later, agricultural scientists and architects with university degrees would give formal names to the principles Wilhelm Radenz deployed. They would talk of microclimate modification and passive environmental design. They would use wind tunnels and sophisticated computer software to model the precise effects of shelter belts on airflow and thermal dynamics, arriving at conclusions that were remarkably similar to the folk knowledge Wilhelm had inherited. He, with nothing more than twine, a dibble, and the accumulated wisdom of his ancestors, had been practicing a sophisticated form of sustainable engineering a century before the term existed. His work was a quiet testament to the fact that true science is not always found in a laboratory. Sometimes it is found in the patient observation of the world, passed down from one generation to the next. The story of Wilhelm Radenz and his wall of trees is more than a tale of frontier ingenuity. It is a lesson in the nature of solutions. His neighbors saw the wind as an enemy to be fought, a force to be resisted with brute strength, thicker walls, more firewood, a war of attrition. Theirs was a solution of confrontation. Wilhelm saw the wind not as an enemy but as a river, a powerful and predictable force of nature. He did not try to build a dam. He chose to build a new channel. He didn't build a wall against the prairie wind. He asked a slow-growing belt of pines to be the wall. This was a solution of negotiation, not confrontation. It required patience, foresight, and a deep, empathetic understanding of natural systems. A plank wall is built in a week. A shelter belt takes a decade to mature. The mockery of his neighbors was instant and loud. The vindication was slow, silent, and green. On the great, unforgiving canvas of the American prairie, the loudest argument did not win. The thing that worked won. And in the quiet harbor behind his living wall, Wilhelm Radenz and his family were warm. If this story of quiet wisdom and patient engineering resonated with you, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more explorations of forgotten history. We believe the past has powerful lessons for the present. Let us know in the comments, what modern problem could be solved with a slow, patient, living solution like Wilhelm's? The video you have just watched presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictional, while the techniques and scientific principles are based on real historical practices. Any application of these or similar techniques in a modern context should be done in accordance with current building codes, safety guidelines, and local regulations. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.